Hey folks, Dan Lapel for New Focus Recordings here with Greg Stuart, percussionist who has a really cool album coming out this Friday, October 7th, 2022. Hey Greg, how are you?
Hey Dan, how are you?
Good to see you.
You too.
Uh, so maybe you can sort of frame this project within a larger trajectory in your work, as I understand it, towards like cultivating a personalized virtuosity. Is that a
Sure.
fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. So this record is a solo percussion record um, with pieces by two composers that I've worked with a lot over the past 15 plus. I've known um, both Michael and Sarah going on over 20 years. Um, that said, this album is really something unique for me in that it represents in some ways a kind of a return towards a more kind of normal percussion playing, um, but a kind of return in a way that also feels like kind of totally new territory for me. So the kind of backstory to why this album is significant for me is that in the kind of mid early 2000s I was diagnosed with focal dystonia um, in my left hand, and without getting into the specifics of the condition, it basically manifested it as like a lack of sort of precision and control in my hand. um, and around say 2005 2006 I started working closely with Michael Pizarro um, with forms of percussion playing that like um, sort of remove themselves from having that kind of control in my hand, as it was no longer an issue. And so I essentially, from you know 2007 onwards, I was making all of these recordings with Michael, but with other composers as well, um, that involved a lot of, I guess, what we would call extended techniques. I didn't think of them as extensions of anything because it was like literally the thing I was doing. There wasn't some kind of standard stable technique out of which these were extensions. It was like what I was doing. Um, and I realized that for probably at least 10 years, I didn't perform or play any music where I was holding, two sticks or mallets in my hand and kind of like playing back and forth in a way that, we were like, oh, they're playing the drums, or there's a kind of standard way of moving as a percussionist.
Right.
um, and sort of somewhere in the middle of this trajectory, I started a trio with Sarah Hennies and Tim Feeney called Meridian. And we played some compositions, but it was mostly the focus was improvisation. And I think this formed in 2013. Um, and several years into that, um, I started playing with two sticks again. And I remember specifically the first time I did this in concert with them. I could sense them sort of like looking over, like, what is he doing? He doesn't do that. Um, but it was the context of this group and the kind of freedom that I felt playing with Tim and Sarah that allowed me to kind of return to that kind of playing. Um, but it was actually through the kind of uncontrolled sounds that I had developed with Michael Pizarro, specifically the dropping of grains on surfaces. So I started experimenting with these sort of like unmetered, uncontrolled, sort of bouncing rolls, oftentimes sort of placing objects on a drum to create further sort of uncontrollable rhythms. So it was like a way of kind of combining those things, and that side of my playing with Meridian grew more and more to the point where with Michael and with Sarah, like the idea of like, well, what if instead of making a piece that was effectively a recording project, and I've done a lot of those in the past, the idea was, well, what if we just had two like solo pieces, where it's like one person playing the piece as a kind of, normal solo work. And I really hadn't done that for, it feels like almost 20 years.
Yeah.
And so this was like really, you know, like it really stood out to me as like this is something new in my work.
Yeah.
And I couldn't have like asked for like better pieces, to do this with. And we can talk more about just the way that like working with Michael and Sarah on these specific pieces developed. But like that's a little bit of the couple threads that are kind of going into the creation of this album.
No, fantastic. It's fascinating. In case I'm not actually sure, we definitely said Michael's last name. So we're talking about Michael Pizarro Lou here.
Right.
And Sarah Hennies, of course.
Yeah.
And we'll have that in the little YouTube description, of course, but just in case someone was confused.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, I guess you referenced Rice Fall, right?
Yes.
I'm trying to remember. I was involved in a performance of that piece in Chicago with the International Contemporary Ensemble. I can't remember if you were there or you were consulting.
Yeah, I was there, and
oh, cool. Yeah.
Rice Fall was and like is a really important piece for me.
Yeah.
I had known Michael starting in like 1996 or so in Chicago, and got to know his music and the music of other Wandlweiser composers at the time. And like, I'm painting with an incredibly broad brush, but the kind of like modal piece for like, mid to late 90s Wandlweiser was like one person playing one sound every once in a while in a long duration.
Yeah.
I mean, there were other things, but that's
sure. Yeah.
There's some truth in that.
Yeah.
And we were both living in Southern California in the early 2000s. Michael was at CalArts, I was at UCSD, and I think he was down in San Diego for a concert, and he gave me the score to this piece, Rice Fall, and it was just like really kind of unexpected for me to see that music, because it didn't seem to be at all like anything that of the music I had gotten to know from him and the other Wandlweiser composers at the time. What I didn't know at the time was that he had gotten into field recording. And there's like certainly a kind of like environmental aspect to that piece. But the thing that was really cool was that like it was clearly a piece about, on some level, percussion. Like all of the sounds are produced by like grains of rice falling on objects. But it was like I was at the time really struggling with like, like controlling my hand. And the funny, or not funny, but the really challenging thing about focal dystonia, it's particularly when it's focal and it's like in a kind of a skilled musical performance context, is that like efforts to try to like fix it through like practice, which is what we do as musicians to like, work on our craft, actually are backfire, because you end up reinforcing all of the kind of maladaptive adjustments that have been created between the hands and the brain. And
interesting.
Yeah, and so the cool thing about Rice Fall was that I've sort of described this to people. It was like the thing you're trying to control, like the stick or the mallet, it just like disintegrates in your hands and just like falls into a million pieces.
Right.
And so it was like totally unrelated to that kind of like coordinated, controlled playing. And it was something that I could do. Like it was like, that's the thing about focal dystonias, is that like they only emerge in these specific contexts. And for me, it was holding a stick in my left hand. Like it would work fine in like every other circumstance, but like for some reason, the specific feel of holding a stick or mallet in my hand would make everything kind of not work.
Sure.
Like, somebody has writer's cramp, has a problem, manipulating a pen or pencil in the act of writing. Um, and obviously that's really challenging when the thing you want to do for in my case was like play percussion.
Yeah.
But the cool thing about Ricefall was that it just sort of said like, none of that matters. Here's some other way of making sound.
Yeah.
And so it was like getting that. And then another piece that I encountered around the same time was I saw Charles Curtis play the premiere of the Eliane Radic cello solo, which,
Uh-huh.
obviously is a piece which, deals with sustained friction. So I got really into bowing, which was like a one-handed technique, basically. It and was something that I could do. And so I got really into like uncontrolled grains and, driven by gravity, and then bowing. And then a whole, and there's some other techniques involved, but like I basically spent, 15 years like exploring these kind of alternative percussion strategies.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And I mean, it strikes me that percussion is sort of the ideal instrumental repertoire to dig into these different strategies, like you're saying, but investigate them on a sort of refined level. I mean, I'm trying to imagine like a, obviously there's plenty of extended technique or whatever like word we want to use that's more sufficient for the situation
Yeah,
on other instruments, but I'm having a hard time imagining a situation where like a string player or a pianist, well, I guess pianists could do like a left hand alone thing, but you'd still be
yeah,
sort of like essentially, interfacing with the instrument in the same way that you encountered the problem with. Whereas
yeah,
percussion somehow has like led the way in opening up uh, a realm of extended technique that's not really extended in a way. Like it's really just investigating ways of sound making that might be totally divergent from this more sort of like conventional performance practice, right?
yeah, for sure. I like when I saw Charles play this Eliane Radic solo, like I literally, like, after the concert, I went directly to, where I had percussion instruments, and just like started bowing instruments for
Yeah,
like for hours,
yeah, yeah,
because I was just so taken by how amazing the performance in the piece was. And I can remember, I don't know, maybe a week later, I was like thinking about it. I'm like, wow, like the level of like refinement in the movement of the bow, and like the cultivation of the sound, and like there's something about listening to sustained sounds that's, for me at least, like really compelling. And the thing that I learned about it, I don't know if this is true for other folks that do music with sustained sounds, was that like we think of sounds like, oh, here's, a bowed string, or rice falling on paper, or whatever the sound is. We think of it on some level as like it's a single thing. Um, but the thing that I learned, at least in my exploration with sustained sounds, is that they're made up of like a lot of different parts,
of course.
and they're all moving at like completely different speeds.
Yeah,
And I got really into this.
yeah,
Um, but I remember, maybe a little bit later, like running into Charles and like asking him, perhaps somewhat naively, I was like, do you ever bow anything like other than the cello?
yeah,
And because I was just like, well, if I could have that kind of bow control, I would, and it was very clear that the answer was no. Like,
uh,
like, and that maybe goes, a little bit to your point of like, at least on the surface, the potential for percussion, like, has historically, been associated with, finding new sounds, and like anything that's like not one of the kind of standard instruments eventually makes its way back to the percussion section. Sarah Hennies has a concept of this in her writing, which she refers to as like everything else.
yeah,
And in like, percussionists often find themselves in this situation. So like,
yeah,
yeah, it's like not unfamiliar, but I also too, like, I've never thought of what I do as like extended techniques. I like literally have thought of it as like, well, that's what I do.
Yeah.
Like it's not like an extension of some pre-existing stable technique. It's just like, no, I was like really into the sound of like dropping grains on different surfaces, or bowing, or other kind of direct friction techniques, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems to me that that kind of openness uh, also facilitates some of the openness in terms of aesthetics and creativity that I think you hear, especially in Sarah's piece.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe you want to pivot a little bit to talk more specifically about her piece,
Sure.
border states. I'm sorry, border loss.
Border loss, yeah.
Right. But actually, I mean, one of the things I was like really uh, taken with about the piece was the analogy, at least if I'm reading the liner notes right,
Yeah,
the analogy between the way borders function and the way that Sarah was able to sort of embed that kind of ecosystem, I guess, in a way, into the way that things states move from one kind of sound to another, and there's not this sort of hard line, but things have it like just as it would be with a border, right? Like
yeah,
you're close to the border, you're going to have some kind of amalgamation of two different sort of cultural influences, and then it sort of
right.
fades, and you can really sort of track that as you're listening to that piece, as you're sort of migrating from different sound areas, but it doesn't really, for the most part, do like hard cuts.
No,
Yeah.
there are like a couple hard cuts in the piece, but basically it's like
Yeah.
kind of continual migration, and that's the way that the piece is really conceived of and designed. So like the title itself is actually a reference to what happens with uh, dystonia, right? So
Uh-huh.
you know in the brain, in the motor cortex, there's sort of a map of the body, and like in the case of the hand, like each of the fingers is like represented by like discrete places in the motor cortex. And when someone develops dystonia, the like the distinction between like the specific digits becomes blurred, right? So it's like before dystonia, like the pinky is like a specific place, and the ring finger, and etc. When you develop dystonia, it's like they're now kind of like blurred into like one thing, right? There's less discrimination between the digits. So like for Sarah, that was like kind of a starting point, like for thinking about this piece. And then the piece really is these like 10 specific sort of sonic states, but they're always kind of they're never static. So it's like you start somewhere and you're always moving more or less to like the next thing.
Yeah.
And so like the process of learning this piece was like learning how to balance like creating something which was like on the one hand identifiable as a thing, but that it was also like on the move all the time. Like, and on a practical level, that would mean like, okay, like I'm doing these sets of things now, and this other thing is going to kind of emerge, and how to kind of balance that, like on a physical level, but also on a level where you could like become slowly aware of some kind of new element, and how that would transform the overall sound.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, let's listen to a little bit, and then we'll chat more. So
Sure.
this is just an excerpt from Sarah Hennies' Border Loss. Very cool. Do you want to sort of give a little bit of a overview of the trajectory? I feel like the piece is organized into sort of like kinds of sounds in a way, sort of properties of sounds, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So the the kind of first half or so of the piece is highly rhythmic. So there's lots of like individual sounds which are created by uh, playing with the hands, which are all done with uh, uh, brushes, and then the feet, which play either bass drums or suspended cymbals that are on the ground, sort of upside down, and then inside the bell of each cymbal is a rock. Um, and so there's a kind of deliberate sort of like uncontrollability to the foot playing because of the movement of the foot from like this backwards pedal and a cymbal that has a rock in it. Um, and that was sort of conceived of as a way to kind of interfere with the playing of the like uncontrollable hands, which
Uh-huh.
are like doing all of these different kind of non repeating rhythms.
Mhm.
Uh, and
Are
there's
those
also
just out of curiosity, like how what's the notation like in that section?
the notation is basically the same for the entire piece, and it's like one of these pieces where if I showed you the notation, you'd have no idea that like this
Right.
was the music that was produced out
Got it.
of this. Yeah. So the score, it kind of looked like the closest thing I can possibly sort of describe, even though it doesn't come close to capturing what the piece is. It looks like the closest analog I can think of is like um, those Feldman scores that have like numbers, like a graph paper, sort of like the King of Denmark,
Oh yeah,
in
yeah.
like different
Yeah.
ranges. Like, but it's also like not like that. That's the
Okay.
closest thing I can think of.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
basically numbers
Mm.
on a kind of quasi graph. But there's also a fair amount of text description in the score.
Mm.
Um, and so but and really the most important like direction in the piece is text, and it's basically saying something along the lines of like there's like rhythmic activity, but it's like non-repeating,
Yeah.
right? So there's like what I'm trying to do is to like play things which don't repeat in any kind of regular pattern, and then there's a kind of like notation in the graph stuff which controls like the density of like and also the instruments that are involved.
Uh-huh.
um
Yeah.
so the setup is basically these four instruments played by the feet, two per each foot. There's sort of drums in front of the performer that are sometimes covered with like parts of cardboard boxes that act like mutes in certain places and then are removed. And then in front of the player, there's like a hanging array of just sort of junk metal,
Mm.
which are sometimes played with the hands, and sometimes the entire stand itself is moved back and forth to kind of shake like a giant wind chime. So there's like um, the first half of the piece involves these much more kind of like discrete, sort of irregular rhythmic sounds, and then near the end of the piece, there are sort of sustained friction sounds from a giant scrub brush, and some shakers and a, a tiny drum filled with beans, like uh, sort of much more sustained sound. But there's a little bit of a bridging between the kind of pointillistic, irregular rhythmic sounds at the beginning, and then there's a kind of transition to like this much more kind of smooth, sustained sound at the end of the piece. But all of this is fits within this framework of like these 10 states, which, as you said a while ago, like you know, there are times when there are borders which are like hard and fast, but a lot of it, the majority of the piece involves this sort of like continual like migration and transformation to like the next state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's really fascinating. I mean, all the ways in which the specific collaboration with you, and given your sort of trajectory with performance over the last
Yeah.
several years, and also this investigation into like notational strategies that facilitate a certain kind of working with sound,
Yeah.
uh, that sort of draws you into very like a extreme level of specificity about the sort of attack, sustain, and decay of the sound,
Yeah.
but isn't in this sort of conventionally notated way that might suggest a certain kind of control, which isn't germane maybe to some of those sounds.
Yeah.
And also the political thing that I think gets brought in to it. It's a very cool and unique intertwining of
Yeah.
various aspects. I think it's great.
Like with the sound from the feet, like they're literally there because they interfere with the hands. And I wanted that to happen.
Right, right,
Right, because so much of the problems that I felt like I experienced, um, with my, percussion playing was a lack of control of the hands. And um, the feet are used in this basically to like interfere with anything that I might even subconsciously be trying to do to control with what the hands are doing. And
yeah,
it's set up in this purposefully sort of uncontrollable and relatively awkward way of playing with the feet. And like I like actually really kind of relish that now. Like
yeah,
I don't feel as if like, oh, I'm not playing this right or whatever, but like you're just kind of controlling the relative density all the time, which is like I go back to Ricefall, like that's what you're
right.
doing in that piece when you're just you're at a particular sort of uh, density that you're playing for any given period of time.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, very cool. Well, I want to pivot to Michael's piece
sure.
for Zoom sort of boots us.
Okay.
um, this was also like the product of a very close collaboration, two-part piece.
Yes.
Part one is mostly bass drum and cymbals, right? Or maybe actually exclusively bass drum and cymbals,
It's
right?
bass drum and cymbals. Yeah.
And then the second part is more pitch oriented
Yeah.
with
Vibraphone and glockenspiel.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Um, should we listen to a little bit of part one first, and then you can sort of give us? We'll listen to the beginning first,
Sure.
and then you can sort of give a little bit more insight into it. So
Yeah.
this is the beginning of part one of Side by Side by Michael Pizarro Lou.
Right.
Great. Why don't you sort of give us some way into part one here?
Sure. So this part one is for a concert bass drum and a couple of different cymbals. And the way that this piece developed with Michael was not unlike other things we've done in the past, from the standpoint of it really kind of proceeded from just spending a lot of time with the instrument and me making recordings of specific kind of sounds on the instrument, right? It wasn't like I'm just getting a score and
Yeah, of course.
it's like here's some kind of interesting techniques, ways of making sound. And um, it it's unique in our work, I think, in that like it's a single movement which involves a whole range of different techniques.
Hmm.
Um, Lots of really kind of interesting, modified friction techniques. There's playing directly with the hands with small dowels. There are a collection of dry leaves which are on the head the entire time.
Hmm.
They're buzzing whenever the drum is struck or rubbed or whatever. There are cymbals which are placed on the head. Sometimes cymbals are dragged across the surface of the drum. There's rosin in certain places to create more friction. And this actually went through a lot of different kinds of notation,
Hmm.
um, including notation that like looked a little bit like sections looked like parts taken from like Pardew's treatise or whatever. And we eventually settled on um, uh, a score that's just text descriptions of the of the distinct um, sort of sequence that I think they're referred to as sequences in the score.
Yeah.
So like unlike Sarah's piece, they're not really like evolving. I mean, they sort of expand and contract in their on their own, but they're not like moving towards the next thing. So it's a sequence of sort of different like friction and some struck sounds, but this like developed a lot in its notation and its pacing. And like Sarah's piece, um, these were eventually learned as sort of felt durations, that we had kind of relative ideas about how long these things would occur. But there's no like stopwatch used. It's just kind of felt in performance. So sometimes it
Yeah.
could be a little longer or a little bit shorter. Um, and the end of the piece is sort of an homage to James Tenney's having never written a note for percussion. There's kind of a micro version of that near the end of the piece.
Is that the rolled gong piece?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's basically what happens is that there's a kind of one of the few transitions in the piece. You're going from sort of hi-hat cymbals, which are sort of scraped back and forth on the head, and
Mm.
then one of the cymbals is swapped out for a large suspended cymbal, which replaces that hi-hat, and you experience a kind of like um, increase and decrease in volume, and all of the kind of like harmonic and timbral variations that you get from that kind of sound, and in a way that like that ended up sort of just like suggesting itself after working with the piece for a long time, and it just became clear that like, well, that's what has to happen here.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm going back to Michael, I'm like, it just needs to be a roll at the end of the piece, doing a kind of um crescendo diminuendo. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. And part two, as we said, migrates to vibraphone and glockenspiel.
Right.
Uh, and I guess, it's interesting coming after Sarah's piece and the first part of Michael's piece. Uh, it sort of registers as a somewhat more conventional sound world, though
Yeah.
it's still very austere and very sort of like inward, with these sort of sustained verticalities and then like
Yeah.
poignant silences between phrases, and
Yeah.
but it's a beautiful way to sort of tie everything together in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Uh,
mean, the connection, I mean, obviously the two movements of Michael's piece are quite different. Like
yeah, right.
if there is a bit of a bridge, it's like in the end of the piece where the simple sounds start making like more defined pitches, and then out of the kind of like harmonic halo of the rolled cymbal at the end, we then get the like chords and like distinct sonorities from the combinations of vibraphone and glockenspiel. And then I also love the kind of reference back to the like the kind of junk wind chimes of Sarah's piece with the like ringing sonorities of the end of the album. But
Yeah.
here, that like you're absolutely right that like on the surface it has a much more kind of conventional percussion sound, but like for me, like personally as a player, like it's like no less like a significant
Oh yeah, of course.
in that like the it's like I haven't played something like this in as a solo in a very long time.
Yeah, yeah,
um
yeah.
and it wasn't the case that like, I mean, this movement is written out basically as conventionally as you could probably imagine. It's, you've got notes and rhythms and fermatas and all of that, tempo, all that. um but here with Michael, the collaboration was really around, you know me being like, physically, like I just feel uncomfortable with where this chord is, and I don't imagine that this is something that like, other players aren't, talking to composers about. But for me, it was like, kind of a big step in returning to this more kind of conventional mode of performance, but putting it inside of a space that like I felt like I had, agency, and kind of the ability, the desire, and just feeling comfortable doing, so that all of that stuff could kind of come together in a single solo piece, and then ultimately in like, the scope of the entire album.
Yeah, great. Let's listen to a minute of the beginning of part two. Beautiful. Well, it was great to talk and get a little bit more inside your journey with this project. And for everybody else, this is Greg Stewart's Subtractions. Comes out this Friday, October 7th, 2022. FCR348. Pieces by Sarah Hennies and Michael Pizarro Liu. And this was recorded at University of South Carolina School of Music and produced by you, Greg. Mastered, or I guess the engineering, mixing, mastering was by Jeff Francis.
Yes.
Mark Wolf did the design, and the images were Dan Wayman. Oh, that's found on Splash. I see.
Yep.
And some really great liner notes by Mariana Ritchie.
Yes.
Cool. So glad we could hook up for a few minutes, and everybody out there, check the album out. Spend some time with this very unique and personal uh, approach to some new solo percussion repertoire.
Yep.
Thanks, Greg. We'll see you
Yep.
soon.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much, Dan.